everybody, and welcome to the BLSI Business and Economics series. It's good to see people turning up tonight, and I just want to run through a few logistical things before we start. And Brian, would you mind just taking your video off and being on mute for the duration of the presentation, please, if you wouldn't mind, Brian. And likewise, Leslie, if you could also activate your screen, that would be much appreciated. There's just Brian needs to sort of unmute himself and take off the video. Brian Snellgrove, can you hear me? That would be really helpful if you could just turn the video off. Well, I'm going to ask him to stop the video. There we go. Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Andreas Wasmuth. I'm the convener for business economics at the BLSI, and I'm welcoming to you into the latest of the BLSI Business Economics series in October on a very different subject. But before I introduce tonight's speaker, just a few points of administration, and that is there's different ways of asking questions. One is by actually, this is obviously not during the presentation, this will be during the Q&A session. You can either unmute yourself and show your video and then just raise your hand in the old-fashioned way and I shall pick you out. Another way of doing things in the chat room. You can use the chat room in Zoom to ask questions as we go along, and then I'll pick them out at the end for Agnes, and then you can either ask it yourself or I can ask it on your behalf. And most of you, I'm sure, will also be familiar with the idea of the raise hand facility on Zoom. So you can actually just raise your hand electronically, and you would also be able to ask a question that way. So that's the way to ask questions. During the presentation, I would be really grateful if you could just keep your video off and be on mute, because that will help both bandwidth, but it will also help Agnes in her presentation. So apart from that, I think that's the main administrative issues covered. If for one reason you find yourself locked out of the meeting, then the only way to go back in is just to log back in with the same link that you've been given, and hopefully your broadband connection will have rectified itself. That's it. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Agnes Nairn from the University of Bristol to the BLSI session today. I've been looking for a speaker like this for a while, because I've never ever, I used to be in marketing myself as a consultant, I've never come across a professor in marketing who actually is taking big business to task for their attitude to our children. And I think fascinating book, The Consumer Children, How Big Business is Grooming Our Children for Profit, is just one example. And it's really something interesting where you actually find an individual like Agnes who actually sort of marries marketing with ethics and actually brings to bear a different attitude towards consumers by big business, mainly in children, but also beyond. And Agnes is the chair of marketing at the School of Economics, Finance and Management at the University of Bristol. And she's a researcher, writer, consultant, and speaker on issues related to marketing, ethics, and children. All issues she's very passionate about. Agnes, good evening to you. I'm really looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Andreas, and hello to everybody. It's very nice to be here. I've been very much looking forward to doing this. So we're going to talk about children and online gambling and look at the question of whether this is an impending crisis. Probably something you haven't thought about before. Now, gambling, of course, is nothing new. We've been gambling before we could write. I think the earliest record we have of gambling is in Mesopotamia in 3000 BC. So, is there really anything to worry about? It's just something that's always been with us. Well, this is a statistic that has had me rather worried. In 2020, 55,000 UK children have a gambling problem. That's under 16s, not just gambling, but actually with a problem with gambling. And the NHS now has gambling clinics for children. So this to me is an issue. But as Andrea said, I'm a marketing professor. Why on earth should I be involved in children and gambling? Well, advertising plays a huge role in children and gambling, and that's going to be part of the focus of the talk tonight. Beyond that, the internet has had an enormous effect on the way that gambling is portrayed and that people actually do gamble. And so I want to look at that at the same time. If we take a look at online and gambling, we can see that the advertising spend on gambling has gone up 56% since 2014, up to £1.5 billion, which is a huge amount of money. And if you look at how that money is spent, 747 million of that is on online marketing, and of that, 149 million on social media. And it's on social media marketing that I particularly want to concentrate this evening. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at the challenges that this throws up, not just for researchers, but also for the regulators. As Andrea said, I spend a lot of my time trying to make sure that big business is ethical in its advertising and marketing. So I want to draw attention to the problems this causes for our regulators. So the internet has completely transformed the gambling industry, and I want to spend a bit of time looking at how that has taken place. Social media, at the same time, has completely transformed advertising, and I want to have a look at that. But the research techniques that we've got cannot keep up with what's happening in industry and technology. And what happens as a result of all of that is that governments are not able to regulate. And that to me is an issue when you've got 55,000 children with problem gambling and it's very, very difficult to regulate. Let me just give you an example of what I mean by the fact that it's difficult to regulate. So the Advertising Standards Authority is the body that oversees the codes of advertising and punishes those who are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And they do a pretty good job a lot of the time. But this is Guy Parker. He's the CEO of the Advertising Standards Authority, and he was speaking at the House of Lords Select Committee that they had a recent inquiry onto the social and economic impacts of gambling, which was published not very long ago. It was published in July. And the Lord Bishop of St Albans asked him during this inquiry, so he said, we have very little idea then how many adverts children are actually seeing online. And the CEO said, that evidence is really hard to get. The challenge here is that there are no agreed metrics to calculate exposure to advertising for adults or for children online. And then he went on to say, we worry about our regulation of gambling advertising. We worry about whether or not we're drawing the line in the right place. So this is a very recent statement. These are very recent issues that underline what is really quite a big social problem that people are not really talking about very much, and I feel they should. So let's look at these three different challenges we've got. So the first challenge is the fact that the internet has completely transformed the gambling industry. If we think about the old days and where we actually would go for a bet, you'd actually leave your house, you would go out, you might go down to Ladbrokes, you might go to some bookie in a corner if you didn't actually want people to know that you were going in there, or you might go to the race course if you were betting on horses, or if indeed you're James Bond, you might actually go out to a casino. So to go to these places, you'd have to feel quite comfortable. You'd have to feel comfortable going into a betting shop, or you'd have to feel comfortable dressing up in your dicky bow and going to a casino. And you definitely have to leave your house. Now, let's look at what's happened now. Because of internet betting, we don't need to leave the house at all. We can just bet at home. We can sit on our sofa and bet. We can bet on the bus on the way to work. I mean, you may at the very moment that we're speaking be betting on the Spain-Latvia football match that's taking place this evening. You can bet anywhere, and you do it in cyberspace. So you can be anonymous. You don't have to feel uncomfortable walking into a dodgy betting site. You don't have to be out in the rain on a race course. You can bet wherever you are at any one time. And that makes betting very different. That makes the image of betting very different. It's moved from being something a bit dodgy, if you like, to being something trendy. And that's a big shift. What's also true is that what we bet on has now changed because of the internet. If we think of traditional betting, there's bingo. People obviously still go out to bingo, slot machines, the lottery, and of course, traditional sport. Now, I thought I'd just put Scotland in there because they actually won something last week for once, not, of course, that I bet on it. But these are the things that we used to bet on: bingo, slot machines, casinos, and traditional sports. Now, we've got this brand new thing called eSports. Now, I don't know how many of you are eSports fans or know very much about eSports, but it is a huge and growing industry. If you were going to watch an eSports contest, this is a little bit what it would look like. You could go to the Royal Opera House, has been used for eSports contests, the O2, huge arenas where people sit and watch other people playing video games. And it's big. There are about 450 million people worldwide that watch esports. The market in terms of sponsorship, etc., is worth about 1.7 billion. And the betting part of it, which is huge, is worth about $10 billion at the moment. It's a very large and very growing market. Now, I mean, in terms of audiences, if we think about something like Wimbledon, you might get about 9 million people watching the Wimbledon final. Whereas with esports, for some of the Counter-Strike Global Offensive finals, you'll get 44 million people watching. And the interesting thing about this, of course, is that the average age of the person watching the Wimbledon final is about 61, whereas the average age of someone watching an esports final is 26. So it's a different thing and it's a different audience. Now, if you haven't seen any esports, here are some of the big ones. There's League of Legends, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO. That's what's called the first-person shooter game, where you go around shooting people. Up in the top, we've got FIFA. So it's football, but obviously it's not real people playing, it's virtual teams playing. And some of the big football teams have got their own esports teams, like Paris Saint-Germain has got its own team. And then we have Defense of the Ancients, where there are warlords all fighting against each other. So this is a little introduction. You know, you can go and get yourself stuck into some of these games after this lecture if you really feel excited by it. What the change that the internet has brought to gambling is really all about is about normalizing gambling. Because gambling can be done anywhere at any time, because it's linked to sports, and from a children's point of view, because it's linked to electronic sports, which they do all the time. 93% of children play video games for an average of about 12 hours a week. Gambling has become something that's normalized. If you ask a young person if they're watching a football match, they will be tempted to gamble because gambling is just part of sport. And importantly for young people, gambling is part of electronic sports. So it's become normalized. And that's probably the biggest thing about the internet having taken over gambling. So that was the first challenge I talked about, that the internet has changed gambling. In terms of advertising, social media has really transformed the way that advertising takes place. And the thing I want to concentrate particularly on tonight is looking at what are called natural or organic postings. Now, if you think about Twitter, which is the area that I've done my research on, if you're a company like Paddy Power or Bet365, you can simply send a tweet and it goes out to all sorts of people in a natural and organic way. You can also, of course, pay for an advert to go out to target a specific group of people, and that will hit the people you want it to hit. But natural and organic posts, of course, just go out into the ether. Then they get picked up by the people who are following you, who then tweet, who retweet, who reply, who send everything on. So natural and organic postings are kind of out of control, which, to go back to that statement from Guy Parker from the Advertising Standards Authority, very difficult to know where this advertising is going. Very different from billboards or TV advertising, where you know exactly where it is and you can't really share it, if you like. I mean, the exposure to social media advertising is completely amplified because it can snowball. Because if you get something that's, very funny or very surprising, people will share it, whereas people don't share billboards or share TV advertising. So we've got these two different things going on. We've got the internet is transforming gambling, and social media is transforming advertising. And these two things together mean that it's very difficult for researchers to keep up even with what's going on, and very difficult for regulators to regulate. And that's why we've got a situation now where we've got 55,000 children who are addicted to gambling. And part of it is to do with the fact that they are seeing a lot of advertising. So I wanted to talk to you about a project that we've finished quite recently. We're just beginning to disseminate it. It was funded by GambleAware, who are the gambling industry puts the money into a pot. There's then a barrier put up, and GambleAware then decide how this money should be used in order to fund projects for gamblers and for research into gambling. So this was looking at the impact of gambling advertising on children and young people. And we worked with a big consortium with Ipsos Mori, with Demos, the University of Edinburgh, the Institute for Social Marketing in Bristol, and indeed ourselves. So the first study that we in Bristol did was to look at what's happening in the Twitter sphere, if you like. What is the volume of gambling advertising that's out there, and what kind of advertising is it? Now because you've got millions and millions of tweets, you can't really do this sort of thing by hand. So we had to use some quite exciting big data analytics methodologies in order to be able to collect this data. So we collected data over 9 months from Twitter's application processing interface, and you can quite legally download these tweets from the Twitter API. We found 417 big accounts from gambling operators. So there's 417 different companies, and we analysed 880,000 tweets. So that's a huge data set. And this, of course, is one of the challenges in trying to understand gambling advertising on social media. There's just such a huge volume. But we were lucky to work with Demos and the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at the University of Sussex with this thing called Method 52, which allowed us to analyse this huge, huge data set. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we did that in a minute. But first of all, let me tell you what the different types of gambling accounts are in this big Twitter gambling ecosystem. First of all, of course, we've got the bookmakers, the big brand names you'll have heard of, like Ladbrokes and Coral and Bet365 and Paddy Power. And interestingly, there's been quite a lot of mergers within these companies recently. So they're becoming great, big, very, very powerful groups of organizations around the globe. Then we have the affiliates, and the affiliates are basically sales agents, if you like, for the bookmakers. They are paid a commission in order to get people to sign up. So Free Bets, for example, would be an affiliate that will be paid by your Ladbrokes or Paddy Power in order to get people to sign up. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the techniques that they use. Then you have tipsters, who are individuals who will they get their money from the customers by telling them, you know, where they think they should place their bet. So you might have tipsters you'll go to who will give you an idea of where they think you should place their bets. I suppose Radio 4 in the morning, when they give you their gambling tips, I guess they are tipsters in the same way. So that was our third kind of account. And our fourth type of account was eSports betting. I mean, eSports betting, as I've mentioned, is becoming very, very big. At the time we did our study, it was an evolving new kind of area. And so we put any kind of eSports betting all into one area. I should say about eSports also is that it's been a net winner from COVID. Esports betting went up 3,000% since the beginning of lockdown, because obviously people couldn't go to actual events outside. So esports has in some ways replaced traditional sports, and certainly in terms of betting, it's been a massive, massive winner from lockdown. So these were our four types of accounts that we looked at. And the first thing we did was to use Method 55, which is a piece of software that can crunch through the millions of data points that you have in a big data set like we had to find out what's going on. So the first thing we found out was that the bookmakers and the affiliates together, so that's the big brands and their sales agents, are producing a lot of tweets, 14 a day on average from them. They produced most of the tweets. So the 109 bookmaker and affiliate accounts produced 380,000 tweets. Whereas if you see the tipsters, there are obviously a lot more tipsters, they're individuals, but they're not as active because obviously they're mainly individuals, they don't have the money behind them. Esports, there were only 44 accounts, and again, they're not tweeting as much, because no doubt they are a much less mature industry. So the first thing to note is that this is big business that is behind this. And if we look at the 5 biggest operators, and actually Ladbrokes and Coral are merged, they're the same company now. The 5 biggest operators were churning out 78 tweets each per day. So if you're following that one of their accounts, you're getting betting opportunities all the time. So if you're someone who's following these, your phone's going to be going all the time, bet on this, bet on that, bet on this, bet on that. It's very, very big. So that was our first big finding. The other thing we noticed was that the tweets are sent out to coincide with big sports events. So if we look at the traditional sporting events, you can see there on the 17th of April, for example, which is near the left of your screen, is the Grand National, there is a spike. The Epsom Derby, there is a spike on the 1st of June. We were collecting data during the World Cup. Of course, there was a huge amount of activity over the World Cup. Now, the 2 colours there, the blue colour is all of the activity coming from an account. So it's not just bet now, it's funny stories and amusing things. It's communication with the audience, huge amount of brand communication with the audience going there, as well as the yellow part, which is the actual bet now type of tweets. So gambling in sport has become almost inextricable, and it happens in real time, which means when you see an advert, you can gamble straight away because you can do it on your phone. If we look at esports, we find it's the same. So we see there towards the right, you've got the Defense of the Ancients, the International, which is their big tournament, great big spike in the number of tweets coming out. Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Face It, which is their big tournament, there's a spike. League of Legends World Championships, that's the one that gets a load more people than the Wimbledon final, a great big spike. So sport, gambling, and instantaneous pressure to gamble are happening at the same time. We also looked at time of day. So you'll see on the left of the screen, it's midnight and goes up to 11 o'clock in the evening. And the blue line is eSports and the yellow line is traditional kind of sports. Now they follow a roughly similar pattern. So obviously there are more tweets while people are awake than when they're asleep. You see with traditional sports, there's a peak 7, 8 o'clock at night. When it's people's leisure time. But interestingly, if you look on the left, you'll see that there are a lot more eSports tweets in the middle of the night, from midnight till 6 in the morning, than traditional sports. And we found that a bit worrying because it's against the regulations to encourage people to gamble in the middle of the night when they're sleepy and not able to resist. But what's happening here is a lot of the esports competitions are happening in China, they're happening in Korea, and they're happening in the USA. And so, of course, a lot of these tweets are coming in the middle of the night. And that's a problem because it's mainly young people watching these, and they're being encouraged to gamble in the middle of the night when the defenses are very low. So that's a bit about some of the volume and the patterns of the data we looked at. We then wanted to look at some of the language that was used and to try and classify some of the tweets in terms of language. So we used natural language processing, again using method 52, in order to be able to do some bits of analysis. And I'm just going to tell you about 2 of the bits that we did. It's an interesting new technique where you can basically train an algorithm to spot different words or texts or groups of words or texts that we were able to use in order to be able to see what was going on. So this is just a little bit about what you do. You come up with some text that you want to train. You train your data set. It goes off and it learns, and then it finds the words that you want it to find. So we did 2 things. One, we wanted to find out to what extent companies were using free or matched bets as a way to entice young people into opening a betting account. Because we know that the word free is incredibly powerful. The minute you see something's free, you want it. Even if you don't really want it, if it's free, you want it anyway. So talking about free bets or matched bets, where it looks as if you can't possibly lose, has been seen to be a very powerful way to get particularly young people, particularly young men, addicted into gambling. So we wanted to be able to pick out tweets that use those words. The other thing we were interested to see was whether these tweets are warning people that gambling isn't a great thing, warning people that there's an age limit to gamble legally, warning that you should stop gambling when it's no longer fun, and warning you that there are terms and conditions attached. So we trained our method 52 to look through the tweets and to be able to see whether there were warnings, to see whether there were terms and conditions, to see whether it mentioned free or matched bets. And it's quite an exciting thing to do. It's quite a novel data analysis technique. And when you're dealing with 800,000 tweets, you have to use something like this to get this kind of picture. So we discovered that 1 in 5 of the bookmakers and affiliates and 17% of the tipsters were using this free and matched bets incentive to get people to sign up. We know it's very powerful, and we know that it can be very dishonest because, of course, a bet isn't going to be free. You're going to pay in one way or another. Interestingly, none of the eSports tweets used this, and what we found was that the way eSports are advertised is very, very different to traditional betting, and that may be because the age profile is completely and utterly different. So that was interesting. In terms of the warnings, we discovered that only 4.5% of these tweets had terms and conditions, which is against the regulations. Only 4% highlighted the dangers of gambling, and very, very few of them had on there that you have to be 18 to gamble. So we found that quite worrying, and of course we've reported that to the ASA. So that's a bit about what we did with our big data analysis. Big data analysis, however, algorithms cannot do everything. They can't really understand pictures very well. They can't understand sentiment particularly well. They can't necessarily pick out the age that somebody is. And so we wanted to drill down particularly into the regulations and whether some of these tweets were against the regulations. And so we did another piece of analysis. So we've used the machines for the first part, but we did need human beings to be able to look at the design features of these adverts, whether they were attached to topical associations, attached to football matches or eSports matches, and whether indeed they breached some of the regulations. So from our huge number of tweets, we drew out about 400 that we looked at manually. And here are some of the things we found. One of the things we found was that none of these tweets were labeled as advertising. And one of the big sort of underpinnings of advertising regulations is that everyone should know when they're being advertised at. And we discovered that these organic tweets were not labeled, so people didn't really know that they were being advertised to. The other thing we noticed was that these are very branded. As I've seen, this is big business that is producing the majority of these tweets, very heavily branded. They had what we called a 360-degree marketing reference, which means that in the tweet, there was an opportunity to bet straight away. One of the other things we were interested in was the age of any people that featured in gambling advertising, because we know that men, and particularly young men, are particularly prone to problematic gambling. And we could see here that 83% in the traditional sports and 80% on the eSports tweets featured only men, which shows that they were really targeting the group that they knew were most vulnerable. And if we look at ages featured, it's actually against the regulations to show anyone under the age of 25 in a gambling advert, but yet in eSports, a fifth of these tweets advertising bets featured people under the age of 25, which, as I've said, is against the regulations. In terms of the topical references, again, with this smaller sample where we could look at some of the topical references, betting is absolutely linked to an event that's happening here and now that's very easy to log into. And when we looked at the breadth of regulations, and if you're interested enough to go and look up the CAP code section 16, which is where all the gambling advertising regulations are, we coded 29 different regulations. We discovered that 68% of the traditional gambling adverts seemed to us to be in contravention of at least one of the regulations, and 74% of the eSports adverts seemed to be in contravention of some of the regulations. And when we look at particular regulations relating to children, a fifth of the traditional adverts, again, were breaching these, and almost 60% of the eSports one. So, for example, adverts should not be particularly appealing to children. They shouldn't have cartoon characters or anything fluffy, or Father Christmas you're not allowed to have, or penguins, or anything that's particularly appealing to children. But we found a lot of the adverts, when we looked at them closely ourselves, seemed to be in breach of the regulations. Here's some examples of the regulations that we felt were breached. So adverts can't take advantage of decision-making errors. And research has shown us, so this is Newell et al., it was the literature review that went with our research, points out that advertised financial incentives are becoming more attuned to take advantage of decision-making errors rather than offering gambling incentives. So we found quite a lot of examples where there's a lot of information in a very short space, which is obviously what happens in a tweet because you don't have much space, which could be confusing. You know, bet £10, get £60, deposit and bet £10, get £50 and a free sport bet and £10 and free casino bonus. Some of it was very confusing and designed to take advantage of decision-making errors, which is particularly problematic if you're a young person and are not used to this sort of thing. Another regulation is that gambling should never be portrayed as a source of regular income. And yet, if you look at this tweet here, this is implying that you can make over £1,000 a month as an income. And 34% of the traditional adverts had something like this, where gambling was shown not as something you do as a flutter for a bit of fun, but as a way of making a regular income, which is completely against the regulations. The other thing that you're not allowed to do in the regulations is to try and make people feel that if they don't bet now, they're gonna lose out. And we found, particularly with eSports, there was a lot of this hurry up and bet, you know, do it now, push, 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 which is completely against the regulations. And as you'll see here, that was 44% of the eSports ads did that. Not quite so many of the traditional ads. They're maybe a little bit more aware of what the regulations are. When it comes to regulatory concerns for children, we did find quite a lot of examples of cartoons, things like popcorn, which is definitely a child-related thing. You've actually got a picture of a child in this Bet Ginger one, and these are definitely against the regulations. You're not supposed to show children in adverts or things that children like. And an extraordinary 59% of the eSports adverts were directly appealing to young people. So perhaps no wonder that children are attracted to these kind of adverts and find them fun. So that was our first study that looked at the advertising. It looked at the volume and the nature of gambling advertising on Twitter in the UK over a 9-month period. And we found that it was heavily branded, it was big business. There was things happening in the middle of the night, particularly for eSports that children are interested in, and that a lot of the adverts seemed to us to be breaching the regulations, particularly in relation to being attractive to children. So the other part of what we did was to look at how people are engaged. Now, as I said at the very beginning, social media advertising is different because you share it, you like it, you retweet it, you reply to things. So we wanted to have some kind of idea of how this happens and what kind of effects this had, because it's not something that many people have studied. So using method 52 again, we gathered all of the tweets that mentioned the 417 accounts that we'd taken on, either by liking them, retweeting them, or replying to them. And that gave us over 6 million tweets from almost 2 million individuals. And we filtered those down so that they were only people from the UK. But that's a huge data set to be analysing. And then we looked at those who were following these. So we found over 4 million public profiles of those who were following particular accounts. And we wanted to see what happened when people followed, when they liked, when they retweeted and they shared. You know, how does gambling advertising spill out across different communities? Here we used a thing called a multi-view neural network analysis, which means we took data from a lot of parts of user profiles on Twitter, and then we used this to try and estimate how old the people who were following and retweeting actually were. Because we wanted to know, are children working in this area? As we saw from the quote from the CEO of the Advertising Standards Authority, he was saying, well, we don't know how much advertising children are seeing. So this was one way to try and find out how many children were seeing and engaging with Twitter gambling adverts. So we managed to do that, and our analysis showed us, the headline figure was that there are about 40,000 children in the UK who are actively following gambling advertising on Twitter, which is a pretty big number. So if we look at the traditional kind of advertising, like boxing, football, etc., you've got 7% of the followers were 0 to 15. Okay, you might expect that to be quite small. 66% are 16 to 23-year-olds and 27% over 24. This is a very, very young demographic. And even within that 66% of 16 to 23-year-olds, of course, a lot of those it's illegal for them to be gambling. And obviously all of the 0 to 15-year-olds, it's illegal to be gambling. And then if we look at the eSports, it's a different picture again. So 17% of all of the followers of eSports gambling adverts are under 16, which is a huge amount. So you've got this number of children who are actively following gambling. And again, 69% are 16 to 24. A tiny percent of the followers of eSports gambling adverts are over the age of 24. It's a very young demographic, so perhaps not surprising that we have this problem with 55,000 children who are problem gamblers. We've discovered a few other interesting things on the way through. We discovered that when there is a visual component to the tweet, so there's a picture as well as the words, that young people are particularly likely to respond. So when we say here engagements, I mean liking, retweeting or replying. We see that 63% of the 16 to 23-year-olds engage with a tweet that has media in it versus 59% without, and only 30% of the over 24s. So the behavior of the younger group, the sort of 0 to 23, well, not the 0, but the younger children to 23-year-olds is markedly different to those over the age of 24. And my PhD student's doing some more work on this at the moment, and he's just finding this big chasm between the under 25s and the over 25s in terms of how they respond to these adverts, which is really interesting. And I suppose part of it is that young people are still undergoing, synaptic pruning. Their brains are still developing up until the age of, until 24 and over. And so it's perhaps not surprising that this young age group are particularly attuned to taking risks and being attracted to gambling. Now, the other thing we found was that eSports fans in particular like to share their tweets. So what this shows, a reply is where you see a tweet and you actually write back to, so Paddy Power says, I'm giving you some good odds on Manchester United, and you write back and you go, I don't think they're very good odds. A retweet is where you send it on to someone else. And obviously it takes a lot less effort to send on a tweet than to actually reply. And if you look where I've highlighted in red with eSports, the ratio of a reply, so engaging by just talking to the company versus retweeting, is huge. So what kids love to do is share these tweets. They love to send them on to their friends. And of course, what that does, going back to my earlier point about the amplification of social media advertising, is it means that lots of young people who might have no interest in gambling whatsoever are receiving these retweets from their friends. And so more and more young people are getting brought into this, this sort of network of those that are interested in gambling. So that was quite an interesting piece of evidence that actually shows us empirically that social media advertising does spread out the gambling message, making it more normalized over time. And when we looked at the proportion of people who were engaging with, i.e. liking, retweeting, replying to eSports, 28% of these were under 16s. So, almost a third of people who are engaging with eSports and sending it round are under the age of 16. So the advertising, particularly of eSports on social media, is having a massive impact on children. So that's the end of the formal bit of my talk. Just to recap on the takeaways, gambling is a problem for UK children. The internet has had a big impact on the gambling industry. Social media has changed advertising. It's quite difficult to do this research. The kind of research we did is quite rare. But without this sort of research, the regulators can't really keep up. Giving you a little bit of insight into the kind of analysis we did. Big data analytics still can't do everything. We do need manual content analysis to do this. And I'm pleased to say that the Committee of Advertising Practice is now acting on the research, which is always a great outcome for anyone doing research in a social area like this, when the regulators are actually doing something. So thank you very much. I look forward to any questions, and I will stop there. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Agnes. That's an excellent presentation. So thank you very much for doing that for us. I think it's a really interesting topic, and one that is actually underestimated. And I think we've got a bit of activity in the chat rooms, which is great. And I've also seeded a couple of things within the chat rooms. So please feel free, everybody, to contribute. Now is the time for all of us really to unmute and show our video if you're happy to do that, because that's one way of asking questions. The other way is by asking a question in the chat room, which some of us have done. And the third one is to raise your virtual hand in Zoom. Now, I've got one from Lorelei Hunt. Do you want to ask the question yourself, Lorelei, or do you want me to ask it on your behalf?
I'm happy to ask the question. It's really just, this is kind of being devil's advocate, but I suppose that the number of children who are problem gamblers that you gave, it sounds like a large number, but given the volume of advertising that children appear to be exposed to, their engagement with, eSports, is that actually, is that actually a large number? Is it a large problem? I'm not saying it's not a serious problem for those children, but is that a large problem? Is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, it's a really good question. How many problem gambling children are too many? To me, 55,000 children with a gambling problem is a lot. I mean, if you look at the percentage of adults who are problem gamblers, it's not, as a percentage of the population, it's not a huge number, but the consequences for those people are catastrophic. And I think that's the issue really, is it's not necessarily the number of people, it's or the percentage, which is what you're talking about, it's what the consequences are. I mean, I think if anyone had suggested, 10 years ago that kids would be problem gamblers, it's, I think it's a surprise to people. But yeah, I mean, there will always only ever be so many people that will become addicted to gambling. Like, lots of people can drink red wine on a Friday night but never become an alcoholic. I mean, that there are a proportion of people that are more or less likely to become addicted to anything. So it's a good, and I mean, I suppose now that we have this figure, the interesting figure will be in 10 years' time, is it still 55,000 or has it gone up? And if it's gone up, what do we need to do about it? But this is the first baseline figure. So I mean, it's a good question.
Well, I think it's partly because I'm of a generation where, yes, you're right, you needed a certain amount of kind of courage, if that's the right word, to walk into a betting shop or to go to a casino. It wasn't something that you and even, you know, I can remember you couldn't even ring the betting shop to place a bet. That was not a legal thing to do for a part of my life. And betting shops were always, the windows were covered. You couldn't even see in them. You know, it was there was always it was kind of seen as something that was undesirable. And I just wonder whether social attitudes to betting have changed, and whether we need to challenge our perhaps preconceptions that it's an undesirable activity. And I morally, that there's a kind of there can be an implicit moral judgment about gambling, and I don't know whether it's kind of still an appropriate judgment. I don't know if we're making appropriate judgments about it, or whether we have to accept that it's a new thing that is going to happen, and in the way that children develop problematic relationships, even just with digital technology and other kinds of ways. Whether, that's I suppose that's all. I don't think I know very well, but
no, I know what you mean, and I think, I mean, the Gambling Act of 2005 made gambling advertising legal. And I don't think there's any doubt that making advertising of gambling legal changed not just its availability, but its image. And the image has changed. I mean, if you talk to young people about gambling on football, they just think it's completely and utterly normal. And then as a society, we have to decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And, you know, we could sit here all night and debate about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I kind of feel that it's gone a little bit too far. You know, I don't think it is desirable that our kids are seeing all of this, so much advertising, because I think the advertising is inextricably linked to the normalization of gambling. But yeah, we could sit and discuss just that all night.
So I've got a question as well, Agnes. I mean, just based on Lorelei's point around children gambling and the volume, but how do they fund their gambling? I mean, presumably they're not going to go through them. It's not their cards, etc. I mean, this will be funded presumably through having access to their parents' credit, debit card, etc.
Yeah, well, there's two things. One, yes, children do get access to their parents' cards, and, you know, I'm sure we've all read stories in the press of kids spending their parents' money on doing out their igloos on Club Penguin or whatever. So yes, so sometimes it's using parents' money, but there's also a thing called skin gambling. I don't know if you've come across skin gambling, and that's if you're playing a video game and you want to have new weapons, or you want to have a new outfit for your character, or you want to have, you know, something attractive. You by your skill, you can collect good weapons, good outfits. These are skins. These are like desirable things for you to have as your personality in a game, and you can use these as currency. So if you've managed to collect some great skins, you can use these to gamble with. You can then sell these in the market on a site like Steam or somewhere like that to get actual cash. And you can then use that, usually in cryptocurrency, to be able to gamble. So there's a whole sub-market going on in electronic games that kids understand and their parents usually don't, where you can use your skill to earn money that you can turn into cryptocurrency that you can then use to bet.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a very diverse influencer model, isn't it? In terms of you know, this isn't just formal gambling. This is actually in-game influencing. You know, built into the very games that people play online.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I didn't talk about, but there's a call for evidence at the moment from one of the House of Commons committees, I think, is on loot boxes. And loot boxes are, you know, where you're in a game and you win the chance. You don't pay to get a new sword, you pay for the chance to get a new sword, and you might get the new sword or you might get some crappy old sword. And so the whole act of gambling is built into the game, and in some countries it's seen as gambling and it's therefore illegal for minors. In the UK it's not yet. I suspect it will be classified as gambling at the end of this consultation, but it's that's a whole it's a whole new thing. There's a whole new business model apart from anything else.
Right. Do any other people have any questions? You can ask it in 3 ways. I'm looking at chat. Nothing else has come into the chat lately, so feel free to use that. Alternatively, raise your hand on the Zoom app, or alternatively, unmute yourself, show the video, and ask a question. No? Nobody else? Oh, Peter, I think. Peter, are you looking to ask a question? No, can't hear Peter. Maybe he'll come back to us in a second. Anybody else? Well, until Peter comes back, I've got another question for you, Agnes, and that is to do with the, you talked about neural networks and things, but I think, did you ever look into the actual self-learning systems and algorithms that the marketing people use to actually track the children's behavior online, and therefore optimize for marketing to them and influencing them to actually drive different types of behavior?
Well, I mean, you're not supposed to target children at all. You're not supposed to target under 13s. I mean, that's a big no-no. Yeah. So, and by and large, I mean, the operators are not doing that. I mean, the gambling operators don't really want to target children specifically because they're not going to be big spenders. So most of this is kind of inadvertent targeting, if you like. I mean, the only thing we did use some avatars. Yeah. So we created some child profiles, if you like, of various ages and with various search histories, and we sort of sent them off into the internet to see what advertising would be served up to them. I mean, the ASA are now starting to use this technology. So we did that, and we discovered that there was, I think it was Gala Bingo, liked to target a young person with a gambling problem, basically, that particular avatar. We did look to see if there was any gambling advertising on children's sites, and there wasn't. I mean, there really wasn't any. I mean, I don't think Paddy Power's out sort of saying, I'm going to target 13-year-olds. I really don't. I think it's inadvertent because of the nature of social media advertising, etc. But it's still not good. I mean, it could be tightened up by using age verification software to make sure that if you are under 18, you can't follow Paddy Power, for example. And clearly you can, because there's 40,000 children doing it. But you could use advertising technology to block, which would be great.
Okay. And do you have much hope for the regulators actually getting better at using big data analytics to actually identify more of these breaches?
Well, they are. I mean, they are now using avatars, so they're using the company that we used in our research. So they are doing that, which has to be a good thing. They are working with Google and Facebook to look at using ad tech to, not ad tech, but ad blockers. They are starting to do that, and I think there've been so many inquiries. So there was an all-party parliamentary inquiry. There's been this House of Lords inquiry. The Advisory Board for Safer Gambling did an inquiry into gambling. I mean, the spotlight is shining brighter and brighter. I mean, I think even Boris said the other day he was going to personally look at it. So yes, I think there will be a change. I'm not normally quite hopeful on these sorts of things, but I am actually quite hopeful that that they will do something.
Okay, great, thank you. I've got a question here from Peter Winderbank. He's been trying, I think, to do it himself, but it's obviously a technical problem. He says, very informative talk, thank you very much. Presumably the regulator and the children are UK-based, i.e. bounded by physical geography. To what degree do the gambling sites exist within the UK?
That is a really, really good question. Yes, the numbers I'm talking about of children, we are UK children. So we looked at their, the IP addresses and everything, and they're UK children. When we went to the regulators and said there are breaches, they came back and said, yes, but some of these companies are not based in the UK. Exactly. And what does in the UK mean? It means, do they have a license to operate in the UK, even if they're based in Curacao or... And it's a very good, and it's a very live question, because you've got sites based in the Isle of Man, for example, who don't necessarily have a UK license. They've got an Isle of Man license, but they're bounded by the UK advertising regulations, even though not the licensing regulations. So how do you sort that one out? And then there are just dodgy operators who are in Curacao, and no one knows who they are or where they are. And they came up on they obviously came up when we looked at the Twitter data, whether you could actually bet on these sites. The regulator said, well, no, you can't bet on these sites because they're geo-locked. I mean, we did try on a few of them and you can get through. But from the regulator's point of view, they would think, well, they're not licensed to operate in the UK, so they're outside of our remit. And if they're outside of our remit, there's nothing we can do. Now, is that good enough? How do you know if they're in remit? It's a bit of a minefield at the moment. And so it does need people to dig into it and go, well, come on, who's regulating this? And if you have got companies that are not within remit, then is it okay that they're advertising to our kids or not? And whose responsibility is it? And which is a big problem with the internet, because it's obviously doesn't have geographical boundaries. Yeah.
And I suppose, I mean, were the different regulations whilst the UK was part of the EU versus now no longer being part of the EU? Are there changes, or are they all the same regulations by and large?
Well, the advertising regulations all come from the International Chamber of Commerce, and then they kind of filter down to the self-regulating organizations. So advertising is self-regulated, so it's not legislated for. So it will probably stay the same, but the licensing is legislation. So that might change with Brexit.
Okay.
It might.
Okay. Well, unless there are any more questions, I think I would like to say a big thank you to Agnes for an excellent talk. I think I really enjoyed it. I think it was really informative, and it's nice to bring something like this to the public attention, which is sort of hidden for most of us for most of the time. So very interesting. And I think also the different dimensions, in terms of the regulations, the advertisers, the diversity of the influencers that actually tackle any gambler, but specifically children. So thank you very much indeed for a very interesting talk. And there's going to be a big round of applause virtually at least.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your questions. Great questions. It's been really interesting discussion too. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you very much, Agnes. Much appreciated. So the series BLSI Business and Economics series continues next month with a talk by myself. I'm going to give a talk on why business must change. Not just in light of the pandemic, but in general, why existing business models are no longer fit for purpose. So that's in November.
Yeah.
And then in December, we have a talk on professional development for the 21st century. So that's the one to close off the year. And I will share the sort of beginning of the 2021 program with the BLSI Business Economics Group over the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, as it's become very customary in these Zoom meetings, I wish you good health, stay safe, and more often and frequently, stay sane in these unprecedented times. So I'll see you in November. All the very best. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.